I said, most of those Austrians would have been Slovenians, Croatians. You can also see a sizable population of African Americans, most of them in Coketon in particular, but it's spread throughout the region as well. And there were many immigrants who lived in some of these outlying camps that I showed on that one slide, places like Benbush, Pierce, Douglas, Coketon. This is an image of Pierce, which Tom and I were talking about before we joined. He was trying to have a visualization of what this would have looked like. This is what the town would have looked like. You can kind of see the railroad here. You can see the sort of lines of company-owned houses. I haven't been through that area in a while, but I think I just went past it without even knowing that's where Pierce used to be. There are lots of places like this throughout West Virginia where this sort of boom and bust, this rapid change that happened, you can see it in many places. And there are a number of families, as I said, who come to Tucker County during this time period, many of them from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe as well. Salvatore and Vanzino de Bacca arrived in the late 1890s, and they eventually entered sort of the small business class. Salvatore was born in Italy in January of 1882 and arrived with his brother in 1899. And they found a job initially in the coke ovens in Coketon, one of those small towns near Thomas. As was often common for most of these immigrants who lived in Tucker County, they would often go back on a regular basis. So Salvatore actually returned to Italy fairly quickly 3 years later in 1902, where he married his wife. He and his wife and his brother came back. And as time went on, they had accumulated enough money from working in the coke ovens for a number of years that they opened a general merchandise store in Thomas in 1903, continuing a sort of brother partnership until 1918, when Salvatore formed a grocery store and his brother Vincent a hardware store. Mary de Bacca, as you can see here in this picture from that company publication, was also one of the first Italian immigrants to come to and work for the Davis Coal and Coke Company mines in Pierce. In Pierce, the company had 3 separate mines operating, and as was noted in a sort of description of his life, he came and laid initially railroad track into Pierce, helped erect some of the early buildings, and then stayed on as a miner afterwards, later bringing his family. The company promoted him in their publication, always noting that he was a loyal employee who has, quote, helped to make Pierce. He has seen Pierce grow from a barren mountaintop to a thriving mining town, and proud of it. There are many different examples like this, particularly from the Italian community. Many individuals who later opened small businesses, but as we'll talk about, hopefully in the Q&A, there's a large sizable number of Italian immigrants in particular who actually will go back home and never permanently stay in the region. So just some other images of other prominent Italian immigrant-owned businesses. Joe DiPaolo's store here. R.D. Benedetto, who had a number of business enterprises, most notably running an Italian-American newspaper, of which we have some issues of it preserved here at the library, here at WVU. And in all of these small communities throughout the region, they have their own sort of ethnic associations, Sons of Italy chapters, among many other types of organizations. Sons of Lithuania, National Croatian Society, the St. Stephen's Society for Southeastern European immigrants, and many of them had cultural musical groups. One of the most visual elements of this sort of local immigrant culture in the region were musical bands and singing groups. One of the most prominent, as you can see here, is the Italian band out of the small mining town of Pierce. It was one of the most widely known throughout the region. It's led by an Italian immigrant named Patsy Santangelo. And all the men in the band, as you can see here in this photograph, also worked in the mines for Davis Coal and Coke. They had regular meetings, practiced hard even while they were working. They were often asked to play for mining institute meetings and traveled to Thomas, to Elkins, and even other places across the state. When many of the men, obviously served in World War I, and they led a large, massive parade that took place in June 1919 when local individuals returned from serving in World War I, and would often play regular 4th of July celebrations at Elkins. Another example of this is the Mountain Echo Singing Club, as it was sort of known in its Anglo form. This was, again, one of those things coming out of that large Austrian immigrant group. This was largely formed by those Slovenian immigrants who had arrived during this time, and many of them, formed different organizations. One of them was a popular singing group, as you can see here. John Urbis and his family, along with several other ones, including Charles Smilas, who served as the principal instructor. And there are other examples of Polish groups, of other types of organizations like this. And now all the small little towns throughout the region had some sort of local cultural presence like this. And even for people in the timber camps, they could regularly come into the towns to, obviously go to a saloon, go to the company store, go to one of these Italian or other immigrant-run stores as well, and also to listen to music from the home country, listen to sort of discussions about politics and family life back in the home country as well. Very sort of vibrant culture that existed in these very sort of remote parts of the state. I say that, but this area wasn't that remote. Taking various train rides, it was fairly easy for immigrants to arrive in New York, take the train sort of, some would go down to Philadelphia first and then come across that way. But to kind of take your way from New York to go on, through Western Maryland down, obviously here into this part of the state. And of course, you have this sort of existing culture in many of these smaller towns. So places like a Douglas as well, which was literally cut out of the wilderness and served as sort of a coal lumber town. Small, but majority sort of various immigrant groups living in the region. And many of them, and obviously these small towns, as I said, were connected by train, connected by sort of other sort of not sort of modern modes of transportation for the time that would allow people to obviously move up and down sort of throughout the region. And just again, some images of Coketon on the left, and this is probably the only clear photo I've ever been able to really find that I like of Ben Bush. Just timing myself, trying to keep myself to this 15-minute initial conversation. Okay, we will. Tom, I think we'll go ahead and stop things there for a while to see if we have any questions or if we want to maybe discuss anything amongst ourselves, and then I can transition into talking about religion.
All right. We got two questions. I'm going to start my video. You need to stop sharing your screen, or maybe not. You could continue to share your screen, and I think both of us would appear on there.
Yeah.
Just a second. I'm clicking on things to close them. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Good. I can't see myself. Okay. Speaker view. Can you hear me now and see me?
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I can't see myself. I don't even know how to do that. But I'll try a question. Yeah, there we go. Al, we got two descendant. One descendant made two comments so far in the Q&A. Lori Tobacco, direct descendant of the S&V Tobacco family, listening in this evening. That's delightful. And Venanzio was one of the great grandfathers of that person. Pretty cool. I wanted to turn your attention to this, the question of what I found out the name repatriation that historians use. This, when they were talking about Italian immigrants in the United States more generally during this period of time, a couple of history compendiums, stories that I looked at said that there were almost 4.2 million arrivals of immigrants from Italy during the period of about 1890 to 1920, and that 1.7 million returned to Italy. Many of, quite many, maybe a million permanently. Can you explain that a little bit? I mean, we've heard that people would go back, get married, bring some of the family back, but I'm really interested in the phenomenon of people coming to the United States for apparently a couple of years, working, and then going back and staying in Italy. How do you explain that, and how does that fit into the overall immigration at that time?
Right. Well, most of them are often leaving the home country for a variety of reasons. Many of them are driven by economic reasons. So during this period of time, particularly in the 1890s, first decade of the 20th century, places like Italy, particularly southern Italy or central Italy, where most of these Italian immigrants are coming from, and more so, parts of, what's now Slovenia, Poland, that part of Eastern Europe. These were areas that were going through rapid industrial change as well. And particularly for people from rural backgrounds, this was a pretty rough transition. So many of them were migrating within Europe itself, finding a variety of types of work, working in coal, working in sulfur mines, working in textile or other types of factory types of work. And by the 1890s or so, the average weekly wage that someone could earn in the United States was so far above what they could make in this part of the world that it was drawing lots of people to come over here, and many of them were saving as much money as they could. Some of them would save enough money and then go back. Many of them would continue to live here for a number of years, and they would just be sending what are known as remittances back home. Many local banks would often, this became a form of banking. One of the elements that banks started sort of adding a service for was to help facilitate that process. So that that's part of it. Italian immigrants in particular, this phenomenon that you mentioned, anywhere, the studies show anywhere from maybe 25% to 40%, don't stay in the United States. Either they go eventually somewhere else or they go back to Italy. There's a variety of reasons for that. Some of it is part of when they left Italy, the country was still underdeveloped. And by the time you get towards World War I in the 20s, the country's become a little more developed economically and sort of infrastructure wise. But that return migration is lower for other groups. So for Polish immigrants, it is dramatically lower. Many of them who leave and come to the United States, they stay permanently. It's more of maybe they don't stay in New York, they end up sometime eventually in Chicago, or they start in Pittsburgh, end up in Wheeling, for example. Jewish immigrants have the lowest repatriation rate because the reason they're migrating is economic and political repression. So it kind of depended on these various groups. For the Slovenian and Lithuanian immigrants, repatriation rates would have been a bit lower as well because of not only economic, but also cultural, Also, some political issues as well within some of the large European empires of the day.
All right, I got one more point that I want to bring up, and then maybe you can go on and talk a little bit about the role of the church and the unique challenges that the Catholic Church, especially, faced with all these immigrants. But let me hold up for you. One of the Friends of Blackwater has been designing and putting up these historic signs in Thomas and Davis and down along the Blackwater Canyon Rail Trail. And this is one about, it's called An Immigrant Family Served in War and Kept Davis Fed. It's about the Davis lunchroom, which belonged to James and Lucy Quattro. And this is one of those families that stayed, and made a commercial living for themselves. I don't know if you're familiar with the family. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to share that with you. It's a great story, and it's been a great project for Friends of Blackwater to put together these signs. I think they got almost 16 historic signs put up in Tucker County in the last 2 years, put together by this guy named David Vago. He's a real serious historian, and he's done a great job of collecting some wonderful old family photos. But he also talks a lot about technology and how things changed in the mines and the railroad industry. It was not a static situation. There were constant improvements in all sorts of technology, and people had to adapt to them. But the hand loading era of the mines actually lasted longer than anything else. The mechanical loading of coal was one of the last things to really take off. For really generations, people were filling those coal cars with shovels. I don't know. You want to say anything about this? I just thought I'd point it out to you.
No, that's very neat. I need to get back in the region so that I can see some of that signage. But yeah, that's also one of the reasons that they're constantly in need of labor, because particularly in the mines and in coke ovens, it's very labor intensive, and you're right, Tom. It's very slow to mechanize. It doesn't really start until the mid 20s, and even then, it's relatively slow. Doesn't really begin to pick up until the 30s or so. So they're constantly needing more workers. And unfortunately, there's obviously a lot of turnover. There's also a lot of accidents and a lot of men that die in the mines. There's also a lot of injuries in the timber. Those rates of accidents is a little harder for us to get because the companies report those differently than the mining companies do. But if you look at the West Virginia annual report and the reports of the annual reports of the Department of Mines, they in very specific blunt details will describe how these men were injured, how many of them met their demise, and it's surprising when you read them and have students read them. They're often surprised. Well, it's a large number of Slavic names, Italian names, Greek. Obviously very, very much more diverse than maybe the region and the state is often viewed as being.
So maybe you should say, since you're talking about working conditions, maybe before turning to the church, I'm not trying to get you distracted, but there were two big dates that I noticed in the labor history of the region that I'm sure immigrant workers and immigrant families were really affected by. One was 1894. There was a big coal mine related strike, national, I think, and then another one 25 years later in 1922. But yeah. Sure, can you talk about the arc of that?
Well, that was actually going to be the sort of third
okay.
little segment I was going to take it.
Take it. Okay. I'll turn my thing off and you talk.
Okay. Well, since Tom has asked about the labor side of it, let me go ahead and sort of jump into that. Because that is a kind of a nice sort of thing to transition into. So just give me 1 second here while Give me 1 second here. Sorry, everybody. I was expecting to go into a different section first, but that's okay. There we go. So as Tom mentioned, there were two principal labor strikes that happened in the county. There were others, but they were not as large, let's say. The first happened in 1894, which is one of the first large coal strikes launched by the United Mine Workers of America nationally. The union had only been formed 4 years later, and it's largely in response to the Depression of 1893, which until the 1929 crash was known as the Great Depression. It's a massive economic catastrophe that left the country in sort of an economic downturn for about 4 to 5 years. Business was sort of flat across the country, and the coal and coke trade was particularly hard hit. Davis Coal and Coke already by the summer of 1893 had to start laying off workers, having to cut costs to really try to deal with the situation. And in early 1894, the general manager of the company, Land Street, one of the common names associated with the company store, sent a notice to all workers in the sort of larger coal field. This was partly to try to keep workers, sort of to stay with the company, but also to try to tamp down some of these calls for unionization as well.
Al,
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Are you sharing a screen?
Yes, I am.
I'm getting some feedback from the audience that they're not getting it. I'm not sure why.
Okay, well.
Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me try to share again and see if I can get that to work for you. How about now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Is it all right if I just stay? Is it all right if I just stay in this? Because I think when we keep going to the full screen, that's causing me some problems of trying to follow where I'm at.
Yes, it's all right.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize, everyone, but it's a little easier for me to see what I'm looking at here. Well, as I was saying, and you can see here on the side of the screen, this is a handbill that workers issued, by May. But earlier in February, the general manager, Land Street, had tried to entice the workers to sort of stay with the company and not go out on strike. They were going to reduce the rent miners had to pay from $5 a month to $4 a month, which might sound good. It definitely would sound good now, but during a time of economic depression, still $4 a month. Coal furnished by the company that miners used to heat their homes would be cut by 20%. Figure probably should get that coal for free since you're mining it. There was a charge that miners were paid to sharpen their picks, and that was reduced but not done away with. And there was a 20% deduction in fees to pay for the company doctor. As you can imagine, none of this really appeased many of the miners who were dealing with and bearing the brunt of these economic conditions. So beginning in April of 1894, miners began organizing in the Elk Garden and Georges Creek region. And over the next several weeks, men began to present local grievances to mine foremen and called walkouts in a variety of towns. This spread to through Tucker County in the mines in Thomas and Coketon. And by late May, as you can see here in this handbill, miners were noting a much larger strike for this wider, what was then referred to as the Elk Garden district. This incorporated Western Maryland, the sort of wider area around Thomas as well. And several thousand miners had appointed commissioners to meet with the company, demanding 50 cents per ton, an end to the company store, and to recognize the United Mine Workers Union. The company, and in Henry Gassaway Davis's papers here in the West Virginia Regional History Center, we have a good sense of how the company responded to all of this. C.W. Daly, who was the general counsel for the company, noted to Thomas B. Davis, Henry's brother, a day after this was issued, that in Coketon, miners walked off the job reporting, quote, personal violence was not resorted to, and I do not believe would have been. The purpose is to shut entirely down, to cut off all expenses and wait until the men are enough to work to some advantage, basically hoping they can sort of wait the miners out and that this will sort of go away. Land Street eventually had about 200 men in Coketon ready to work by May the 24th, and Davis himself had sent to Richmond to get a large number of African-American men who were basically serving as strikebreakers. These men were guarded by the deputy sheriffs and other men supportive of the company who were armed with Winchester rifles. The men were quickly brought in under protection and put to work in the various mines throughout the region. If the strike didn't end quickly, Land Street told Davis that they would actually need to bring more African-American miners. They would need more from Virginia, probably from Baltimore as well. I won't quote directly what they've said, which I have in my notes because they used the language of the time period, which is not appropriate to describe these strike breakers. But within a few days, mine managers are noting that more miners are going off the job, and it's beginning to expand. Although by June the 5th, company officials noted that 38 loads of coal had been shipped out of Douglas and Coketon, so they're starting to break down this strike. The strike remains strongest in Thomas itself. That's where they sort of maintain a pretty strong presence. There were all kinds of rumors spreading throughout Western Maryland, as far away as Cumberland, that miners were going to spread throughout the region, and sort of start a riot, basically. Maryland militia troops were made at the ready starting on June the 5th, and sort of the area was put on high alert. On the 5th, things were going pretty well at Coketon. And things seem to be going fairly well. This is an image around late May showing the UMWA miners on strike, posing for a picture here at Coketon. This is a large immigrant group. You can see several African-American miners as well. They have several flags here in the back. This one on the right is clearly American flag. I'm not entirely sure what the one on the left is. It's not entirely clear. And here, of course, on the same day are guards armed at Coketon to sort of protect strike breakers who are being brought in to work the company's operations. Things turned on June the 13th, 1894, when there was a reported riot in Thomas, and I say riot in air quotes. Land Street, writing from the county seat Parsons on the following day, noted, quote, an attempted riot at Thomas is now being investigated, end quote, by county officials. According to the correspondence we have from the company, this strike was being led by a Polish immigrant, several other Polish immigrants and their wives. According to the county sheriff, these immigrants, the main ringleader, had been run out of the county, even though they were still looking for them. The company used the court system fairly effectively, and indictments were issued against a variety, particularly 30 leading strikers who had had a main role to play in organizing the strike. Polish coal miners in the Thomas region continued to protest, and even as late as June 20th, a week later, many of them were still refusing to go to work. One thing that did help in the situation here, as opposed to in southern West Virginia, where often you would see bloodshed in these types of strikes, was that Henry Gassaway Davis himself often intervened to try to tamp down the sort of animosity. In particular, he did not urge his managers to evict miners from their homes. So that more quintessential image we have of armed guards, particularly the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency in southern West Virginia, coming in to evict miners during the strike. That didn't happen. Davis actually told Landstreet, in his own words, why he didn't want to do this. And I think it's an illustrative quote. He says, quote, "It appears to me that if I was a tenant, my goods should be taken out and left in the street, that I would be more desperate than I otherwise would be, more likely to commit unlawful acts," end quote. And so that is a little bit of a unique thing in the way these strikes often went. Often the owner is often intensifying the escalation of tensions. In this case, Davis is actually trying to play a more moderating role. The strike eventually subsides by early July. The company eventually only allowed about 1/3 of the men who went out on strike to return to work, primarily at its operations in Coketon and Thomas, where the strike had been the strongest. And so this is where a large number of the African Americans, they would come in, many of them will stay on and continue to work for the company for a while. But even after this strike, a number of years later, the company is still complaining about the fact that it doesn't have enough workers. Superintendent John W. Galbraith noted in May of 1901, quote, "Natives," meaning native-born Americans, "are very scarce indeed. What few we have had only stayed a few days and have gone into the woods," end quote, meaning to work in the timber operations, which paid a bit higher than what the mines were paying at that time. And so he noted to the company that they were having to rely increasingly more on foreign workers, particularly Italians, among many others. And this continued to become a regular sort of occurrence for the company in that first decade or so of the 20th century.
So, can you hear me, Al?
Yes.
So, there's a long gap between 1894 and the next big one that we have photographs and historical coverage of, the 1922 one. What accounts for that?
Well, some of that we actually have some oral history interviews that were done with immigrant miners back in the 1960s. A couple of oral historians, John Steele was one of them, actually did a number of oral interviews, and they found a few interesting things from talking to some of these immigrant miners. Many of them noted a couple of things. One was that the company was what we would call today more paternalistic. Eventually, they paid higher wages than other coal companies would pay. Their houses were better. They had more amenities. It was cleaner. So there wasn't that sort of, I guess, to compare it again to southern West Virginia, there wasn't that desperation conditions that existed. So some of them noted that many men were like, well, what difference does it matter to have the union when, this company's paying us pretty well. Others noted as well the transitory nature of the workforce. As we mentioned, if there's a lot of immigrants coming in, coming out, migrating to the next job, it makes it hard to really try to organize a union. Many of them noted that the company as well, discouraged unionism as much as possible, either through, subtle coercion or, just speaking, of how useless the union might be. But they didn't have the sort of repressive system that, we would think of in the southern portion of the state.
And in the 1920s, things must have changed somehow. Was that a national economic issue where the coal companies really just were harder to deal with because it was difficult for them too?
Yeah, and the union did finally gain some strength in Tucker County during World War I, and that was common in many parts of the state. During World War I, the federal government set up a number of regulatory bodies to really kind of, keep the coal being mined for the war effort. In exchange, they kind of encouraged operators to recognize the Union. So in the Fairmont coal field, Consolidated Coal recognizes the Union during World War One. Here, the Union is able to gain a foothold in 1917, 1918 as well. But once the war is over, when the war is over, they have a situation very similar to what we're all dealing with now. There's rising inflation. Miners' wages start to not keep up with the rising costs of goods. And coal companies, their profit margins on selling coal had been quite high during the war, and now they start to decrease a bit. So the companies want to cut back. Obviously, one way of doing that would be to break up union contracts that maybe have set higher wages and other, other set costs like increased safety or having to hire another sort of couple check weighman or something else. So companies begin pushing back against that in the sort of a year or so after World War One. Some of that is what is leading to sort of what's known as the mine wars in the southern part of the state. In 1922 is a national strike like 1894. So it's a strike that's being supported nationally by the newer UMWA president, John L. Lewis. It's very active in the Midwest, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, but in West Virginia, it largely fails. And this is happening a year or so, not really a year, but a number of months after the failed march on Blair Mountain that happened in Logan County in late August, early September of 1921.
Do you, in your slides there, do you have that some of the pictures that were taken of the 1922 strike?
Yeah, I can go ahead and sort of move into that as well. Like I said, it's a little tricky for me to.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I think that really tells them, So, do you think that that the fact that so many of these folks, miners, were born in other countries and had come here and were new to the U.S., how did that really affect the ability of organized labor to speak for and mobilize those people? Maybe in some good ways, maybe in bad ways.
I think in some good ways, many of them actually were more receptive to unions than native-born workers were, honestly. Yes. Many of them came from countries that had a strong labor tradition. Some of them had problems with the language barrier, obviously. One benefit with the United Mine Workers Union was that at the time in the early 20th century, they were really on the cutting edge of this sort of industrial form of union organizing. So organizing all workers across the entire industry, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity. That was very uncommon in many unions in other sectors. And so they actively had organizers who were from those immigrant backgrounds. So when they're organizing a campaign, they would have an Italian language organizer. They would bring in somebody who could speak Polish. They would bring in people that, could sort of communicate effectively to this sort of multi-ethnic workforce.
I want to, Hal, we've got a little bit of time. I want to encourage the folks in the audience to type in a question or a comment in the Q&A so we can get to it, because we're closing in on it, or certainly the last half hour of the program. So exciting. We've got 20 people who've been attending the entire event and learning a great deal. We're talking about languages. There's a chance to segue here to away from the labor stuff, but so we can cover it and talk about the other huge institution in so many people's lives, the church, who attended. I realize that if these people are just coming for a couple of years, but they came from cultures that had extensive religious traditions and mostly Catholic, I imagine. Although the German immigrants who were a little bit earlier, you had a strong Lutheran tradition, and there were Dunkers and different, all kinds of different uh, religious ethnicities that have come to Tucker County. But if we look at this one period that we've been talking about, a lot of Roman Catholics, I don't know about Greek Orthodox and Orthodox Catholics, but a lot of diversity now, and yet all kind of packed together in one very close geographic area, not so that they kind of had to get along, and the Catholic Church probably had to serve a lot of different languages. Well, you want to talk about that a little bit, the religious part of this?
Yeah, I can do that. Let me 1 second here, and I will share again just so we can look at it a little bit here. I think if I do this, can you see the screen well, Tom?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is honestly the way I got into this topic years ago, was just through some of the work I had done in the Catholic diocese archives in Wheeling. I was researching mainly for the book that Tom mentioned earlier, and I just kept finding all of these files about issues in Tucker County, which at that time I didn't know they had this sort of diverse immigrant population. But as you mentioned, everywhere in the state where we saw large numbers of Italian, other Catholic immigrants come in, one of the first things they want to do when that population gets large enough and established, for people who want to maintain a longer presence for that population, one of the first things they'll do is they'll create a religious society, as I mentioned earlier, with the goal that that can get enough numbers, get enough people to generate enough support to petition the Catholic bishop, who at this time is Patrick Donahue in Wheeling, to encourage him to help finance the construction of a parish. The control of having some physical space to sort of call their own, so to speak, is a very common thing you see in these immigrant communities. Now, part of the issue here is a little different than what we see in the urban areas of the state. Any of the land where any of these churches are going to be built on are owned by Davis Cole & Koch or Henry Gasaway Davis or someone like that. So there's a lot of back and forth often between company officials and the diocese about, yes, we will give you the deed to this land. They'll want some input on, what type of parish is it going to be? And the diocese historically would always want to build parishes that what we would call territorial. Territorial meaning, as you can see here, building a Catholic parish in Davis that all Catholics would attend. So all the Catholics in Davis and the surrounding area, this would be your parish. That may not seem hard for us to understand now, but this is a multi-ethnic workforce. And so naturally, you would have Italians, Slovenians, Poles, Lithuanians, Croatians, all attending a parish. Well, at this time, most of the mass is done in Latin, obviously, before the changes in the mid-20th century. But the music, the homily, all of those aspects are kind of set by whoever the priest is. So if you have early on an Irish Catholic priest, which most of the hierarchy at this time in the country are Irish or German, they're going to speak in English or in German. So you start seeing this push pretty early on to get a sort of revolving door of sort of foreign language speaking priests from a variety of different backgrounds. And it kind of reflects some of the wider changes that are happening in these parishes, particularly St. Thomas and St. Veronica's. Initially, the parish in Thomas initially was made up of Irish and French Canadian Catholics who mostly spoke English, of course. As time went on, the parish sort of changed. It became much more an Italian and Polish parish with numbers of Slovenians, Croatians, even Russians and Lithuanians. In Davis as well, you saw a similar thing where it started out very clearly as like an Irish sort of parish, but then as time went on, kind of brought in other groups. In Thomas, for example, just to give you a sense of this change, the first families that helped found that parish, their last names were Noon, Gallagher, Curran, Higgins, and O'Day. Very Irish Catholic sounding names. And by the late 1890s, turn of the 20th century, there are so many more Eastern and Southern European immigrants demanding to have services in their native language that this is going to create some changes. So just to give you a sense there on the screen, in the parish there in Thomas, you have ministers who have very short tenures, but you can tell are reflecting more of this sort of multi-ethnic sort of background. So in particular, they're trying to get parish priests who, speak multiple languages or who are, either Polish, Slovenian, Croatian, so that they represent one of those larger groups. The Catholic Church in Thomas at its height actually had about 2,000 people, and they had to have several services on Sunday. And as I said, they had kind of a revolving door of different parish priests. From my own research in Wheeling and elsewhere, this could be for a number of reasons. Sometimes those priests would get tired of having to deal with all of this friction between trying to serve this multi-ethnic population. Priests also would sort of serve there in the parish, but then they would also have to go out to the timber camps. They would have to go out if they set up any missions in the outlying areas of the county. So they often would complain that they were sort of on this sort of perpetual mission trip to really kind of serve the sacraments to everybody equally throughout the county. As the numbers in the timber industry and coal industry start to change in the 20s and 30s, you start to see, see these populations obviously start to decrease a bit.
Hal,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm just looking at your slide there. Go back. Could you go back to that slide there? Because I barely saw that one. The one with yeah, right. Who's that a picture of?
That is Bishop Patrick Donahue, the Catholic Bishop of Wheeling.
I see.
And so the problem that the company has and that the diocese have, as you can see, technically the company employs at least 22 different nationalities, most of which are Roman Catholic. And so beginning in 1904 or so, the bishop is constantly trying to find parish priests either in Pittsburgh or in other larger cities to see if they would be willing to relocate to Tucker County. And initially, one of the disputes involves trying to get a Lithuanian priest, whose name you can see there on the screen, Joseph Satokas from Pittsburgh. This upset the priest in Thomas, who was Polish, who didn't necessarily want to work with a Lithuanian priest. But this Lithuanian priest actually looked forward to the idea of working in Thomas because, as the Polish priest argued, quote, he considers that in our place, the missionary work with the languages he possesses would be a great benefit to the church and community of Thomas. So the fact that he could speak multiple languages, could sort of cater to different people. And the company was very concerned about appealing to this large and growing Lithuanian population around Thomas. So one of the company managers, a man named J.F. Healy, in one letter asked Donahue for, quote, priests who can speak Lithuanian. And that had been a big need in the parish for a number of years. And Lithuanian miners and their families had basically been demanding that any of the priests there needed to be able to speak in Lithuanian. This was a concern for the bishop and for the other leaders in Wheeling because they would prefer to not. They would prefer them just to listen to and have a central figure to follow. The danger for Donahue is the fact that what this often did in parts of the state would lead to parishes splitting off. So if a population got large enough, let's say in this case, if the Lithuanian population got large enough, they may actually have enough numbers to demand another parish. So this could become costly for the diocese. the chancellor of the diocese, Edward Weber, noted quite bluntly this problem, saying, quote, "One district wants a Croatian or Croat, another a Greek, another a Hungarian, another a Pole, another a German, another a Lithuanian, etc. Hardly a week passes but what there is a request for a priest of some foreign nationality," end quote. The company itself often had disputes between English-speaking miners, and particularly the Polish-Lithuanian miners. And the company's perspective was they hoped that if the parish could become strong enough, the parish would maybe serve as an Americanizing force to kind of calm down the situation a bit. And J.F. Healy, as you can see in this quote in 1906, notes, "The Americans could have one mass each Sunday and the Poles, Lithuanians, and Slovenians the other," as a way to try to, maybe accommodate this situation.
I got a question for you, came in. The question is, what ethnicities around the time that you're talking about, what was the largest and the dominant? What?
The Italians would have been the largest by number. I hate to say this, but in the Italian immigrant community, there's a lot of literature about, communities, people, large numbers within the Italian immigrant population that are very religious, very tied to the parish. And then there's this very strong anti-clerical tradition as well. I would say in terms of Catholic, this sort of Catholic sentiment, it's strongest amongst the Polish and Lithuanian miners and their families. And I would say also the Slovenian and smaller Croatian population as well.
Another question that we have is politics. Obviously, an interesting time in West Virginia politics, and I don't know if you've looked into by now the Republicans are ascendant statewide. Henry Gassaway Davis was a Democrat, the grand old man of the Democratic Party, but his son-in-law, Stephen Elkins, was a Republican, and they both were out looking out for the coal companies and the rich people in general. But still, there was partisan politics, and I think Tucker County switched from Democrat majority in the presidential elections in the 1890s to electing Republicans, and they were in power for quite a while after that time. The Democrats had taken power in the 1870s, and it was in the mid 1890s and switched back to Republicans. Well, the question that the participant asked is, how's the church come down on political issues? What influence do they have, if you know?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because they try to stay out of it. I would say in terms of like what parish priests concerns are, let's say between the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, one thing they are very unified against is any socialist party influence. There's a big concern at this time in the Catholic hierarchy about socialism and the growth of the Socialist Party in the state. Donahue himself actively courts support from both parties. He's a pretty effective bishop in that regard. But as time goes on, by the turn of the 20th century, you're seeing more of these immigrants, particularly the Southern Eastern Europeans. They'll gravitate slowly but surely more to the Democratic Party for a number of reasons. One of which being, the role of prohibition, but that takes until the teens and 20s to really happen. But many of the immigrants, and even some of the ones in the oral history interviews that I mentioned that we have here, when asked about voting, because the interviewer would say, well, the county was very Republican. What did you vote? And they were like, I was a Democrat, but I could never vote that way, basically. You had to vote Republican because the people looking at your ballots worked for the company and they wanted you to vote Republican. So most of them, some of them say that there was a more stronger coercion that went on. Some say it was just kind of a subtle sort of coercion, but that's mainly why That's mainly why there was that sort of strong sort of one party control.
I got, and I'm asking you, I'm talking here and you can't see me, I guess. So I appreciate your attentiveness, and I'm just interrupting. I don't care, but the audience doesn't need to see me. I got a couple more comments here related to that. Is the question of what was the relationship between the church and the coal companies themselves? Were they concerned? Were the companies fearful of the influence of the church?
No, and that's a great question. They actually really saw the church as something that could help them. And it was kind of this subtle thing that, they don't want to show their hand so much among the miners, but, they, in their correspondence, and there is a lot of it in the diocese archives between company and fit. This is probably the company that I found the most of that sort of actual conversation that's documented. There's all kinds of letters talking about their hopes that the priests will Americanize the workforce, that they never go out and say, like, to discourage the unions or anything like that. One of the biggest things that they wanted the churches to do was to stop the carousing. One of the big complaints company officials had was with the foreign holidays, as I have listed here, that these immigrant workers would take off for all of the saints' days, all of the variety of holidays, and drink for 3 or 4 days. And, that caused problems of, we can't mine coal regularly because half the workforce took 2 days off to celebrate a saint's day. So could you maybe try to deal with that, encourage them that it's important to work first and then, carouse later. So they kind of saw, I think they saw the church as playing a sort of Americanizing a sort of cultural influence, let's say.
That's interesting. I've got a couple comments here. One person says, just FYI, Archbishop John Hughes of New York, Gang of New York, which is a movie, TV series, right? He was a cousin. His family emigrated from Ireland to Chambersburg, and the commenter's grandfather went to the Catholic high school in Cumberland. So that's pretty cool. We have a question, and one person said it's interesting to think of how things were handled differently in Wheeling with more ethnic parishes. And that's quite, it's not something that's self-evident. It's interesting to me. I just want to make a couple of interesting points about the immigrant communities of Tucker County. I don't know if you've got a real response to them, but I'll make it and turn this thing back over to you again. But two other ethnic groups, we haven't talked about the Germans much. And yet they were amongst the earliest and quite prosperous immigrants to Tucker County. And speaking of churches, the Lutheran Church in Davis is just simply built in around 1890s, right around this period. A gorgeous structure, and obviously people put some serious money into that, and they were intending to congregate like crazy. That's a beautiful thing. And the first sawmill was by Henry. You know something about this because you know about because of your great podcast about Henry Schlumberger, the great German brewer. And the Germans had a very rich culture too, but they had to sort of back off after when World War I came along. It caused them to sort of draw in their claws a little bit or something culturally. Any thought about German culture in Tucker County or German immigrants? Yeah.
I think you're right that before this massive influx of Southern Eastern European immigrants, they play a large role in sort of, a variety of areas of the county, and if you just look at some of the people, as you mentioned, that own small businesses that some of the lumber companies as well, many of them are Germans who arrived in the mid 19th century or in the years right after the Civil War. Many of them were more, let's say, they had entrepreneurial backgrounds in a variety of ways. I think what's interesting here is that, that group got so overwhelmed by this mass influx of Polish, Italian, Slovenian, they kind of get sort of lost in the story a bit. But in many areas of the state during that time, as you noted during World War One, any outright German influence is sort of shunned.
If you look at the population numbers from Tucker County, they certainly reflect this population incursion. You're talking at its peak 16,000 people, starting with 1,000 in 1870 or something like that, or 2,000, working its way up to about 7,000 for quite a while, and then all of a sudden, kaboom! It explodes and gets up to 16,000. And now we're back down to about 7,000 folks. Like quite an arc. And
14%. What about that?
He's all we are told. Judy's here talking to me too. She's going to tell me what's going on. Hey, we're down. Hal, we got 15 minutes at the most to go. So what do you want to touch on? Oh, the other ethnic group I want to talk about is, let's not forget the French Canadians who came to Canaan Valley to cut timber for the Rumburgers, because nobody local knew how to float those logs. In my imagination, at least a couple of them met local girls and stuck around.
Well, and as I mentioned, they had a pretty prominent presence initially in several of those two early Catholic parishes I mentioned.
Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, those parishes were, I would say, as much Irish as much as French Canadian. To a certain extent, but again, once this big mass of immigrants arrive in the 1890s, turn of the 20th century, they kind of get, I don't want to say lost in the shuffle, but some of those earlier groups might have a little bit better staying power, legacy in the county, because they'd been here for a longer period of time, intermarry with the native-born population, or with other established older immigrant populations. So. Whereas those other older groups that come later in larger numbers, yeah, they come in larger numbers, but then there's a large number of them that leave as well over time.
So carry on, Hal. How would you like to wrap this up as you talk about this fabulous melting pot?
Let's see here. I'm trying to think what we haven't talked about yet. Do we have any more questions?
Let me take a look down here. Got some people mentioning that they had ancestors from the Germana colony. Well, yeah. So one question was, and I don't think you directly addressed this. What about racial tension? I mean, obviously, blacks coming into the strikebreakers is not going to make anybody very happy. But in fact, when we look at pictures and we hear stories, we see that both Tucker, there were segregated schools that were established, and black coal miners raised families and prospered in many ways, and worked side by side with whites for the same money, and at the same kinds of tough labor. And so I think there was probably a lot of camaraderie and respect as well. What do you as a historian, what's your sense about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the height of the emergence of Jim Crow racism. And obviously that role that many of those African-American miners played in 1894 as strikebreakers, that does create a lot of tension, obviously. The Klan had a presence, in the area as well. But the Klan, to be honest, by the time of the teens and the 20s, when the Klan comes back nationally, the Klan is just as much anti-immigrant as it is anti-African-American. So, like you said, a lot of these miners, a lot of these sort of working class folks that, work in the similar industry have, very similar conditions, they have some camaraderie that, is important to note. But I think it's also important to note their housing was segregated. Like, they were physically segregated in where they lived. So in many of these company towns, I didn't mention this, that they would sort of self-segregate the neighborhoods almost. Like, this would be the group where the Italian miners would be living. This is where the Hungarian miners lived. African American miners notoriously either lived the furthest away from the mine portal, so that they had to walk the furthest to get to work, or they would often be housed right next to a mine portal. So the dirtiest, the most dangerous place. And as you mentioned, obviously in the research you've all done previously, there's a lot of, they have segregated schools. There's a lot of, aspects of segregation that exist as well. And where those tensions come back later is when the mines begin to mechanize later on, and you have work, there's going to be a need for fewer workers. African American miners are often the first fired and the last rehired, is the common phrase. Or if they are kept on, they're not allowed to learn how to use maybe the technology so they can move up. But in this hand loading era where everybody's kind of loosely, kind of making similar wages, kind of dealing with similar conditions, there is a certain level of, camaraderie maybe going on.
Question, did coal companies provide health care services? How was that handled?
They did. They had company doctors. They had a pretty elaborate system where they would you could go see doctors. You could they would have doctors that would go around as well. That was one of the things the company often liked to praise about itself, compared to other companies. They sponsored regular first aid competitions and other safety things as well to try to keep their accident rates down as well. And I know I talked about this last time when the Spanish flu pandemic, as it was called back then, the company actually set up a number of company hospitals throughout the region, in the various camps throughout the county to try to deal with the rising numbers of people in 1918, 1919 that came down with the flu. So, they were, I don't want to say pretty progressive for that time period, but let's say compared to some of these other coal companies in the state that, didn't necessarily provide that type of a service. Again, that was one of the things that made it hard for the union to really gain traction for a while, was the company provided so much there in Tucker County that it, didn't seem, why do we need to go on strike? What do we need necessarily?
I think I've gone through pretty much all the questions that we had. Somebody wanted to know about environmental issues related to the coal mining. Did immigrants have sensitivity about that? I'll tell you what, before you answer that, let me just go ahead and mention something. One of the as I was researching for this event, I saw that one of the big sources of labor from the folks who came from Italy was Sicily, and that Sicily had a remarkable and rather frightening industry of mining sulfur. Some of the world's great sulfur deposits are in Sicily, and they were mined deep in the earth. It was like 125 degrees down there. They had children doing the mining. It was just ghastly. And that industry collapsed at the end of the 1800s, I think because sulfur was discovered as a byproduct of oil refining. And whatever it was, a lot of sulfur miners left Sicily and came to the United States and worked in deep mines. I'm sure many ended up in West Virginia. But talk about an environmental catastrophe. That was just extraordinary. But do you have any thoughts about the miners and sensitivity to environmental issues?
I mean, in coal at this time, there is some concern, but this is before the sort of period of dealing with large amounts of black lung, let's say, which is more of a health condition. I mean, obviously working in the lumber process, the deforestation that's happening, it is, I mean, one thing I would say that they would be more aware of at this time that we maybe don't appreciate. The state had a large number of sort of major environmental problems that were starting to crop up in the, let's say, the first decade and a half of the 20th century. So they would have been dealing with regular flooding. They would have been dealing with almost, periods of heavy rains followed by, period of heavy drought conditions. Because of the, clear cutting of the forest throughout the region, it's very hot in the summer. Whenever it rains, they're dealing with mudslides and other issues to, if they were trying to form foundations.
If you look at the some of the standard histories of Tucker County written by local folks, they really do. It's remarkable. Point to community leaders who expressed real regret at the total destruction of the forests. I mean, it was accepted as something that was not much that folks could do about it, but it was seen as a great loss. And I think that's some of the older folks who'd been came from agricultural backgrounds and things like that, just hated to see that sort of thing. And they expressed that even at the time. But the dynamic of defeating those sawmills until there wasn't a single big tree left really could not be arrested, could it?
Yeah, I would add also the one other area where workers would often talk about, changes to the environment. People who worked near coke ovens and worked, and lived near coke ovens. That coke process, it produced a lot of air pollution. It put a lot of, various chemicals up into the air. So people would often comment, the smell, what it would smell like, what it burn your eyes, burn your throat. So, that's another area where you often hear people comment at the time about, some of what we would consider environmental conditions as well.
Al, I'm going to turn on my camera. I don't know if it'll work or not. Yeah. Put the gallery view up. I just want to hold up another copy of your book.
Oh, thank you.
We got to plug the book.
I appreciate it.
This has been a great program. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everybody else did. Let me see if I got any more comments down here. This was a terrific session. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah, I've told Tom that I have been on a couple of these where we've kind of mixed it up. Instead of having somebody just talk, we do some lecture material, then do some questions, and do some back and forth, and it's a bit more engaging. I know I like it as well, and also allows for some democratic participation to maybe take me off script a little bit, which is fun.
We got just want to let people know that we've got a very exciting program coming up in July 16th. It's a Saturday at the old courthouse in Parsons. Program called Shootout at the Depot, about a famous feud and a book between the Eastham Thompson case, a fabulous murder trial. And we're going to reenact the thing with local folks participating. We're co-sponsoring that with Art Spring, I think, and also with the Tucker County Historical Society. Tucker County's history is a rich and valuable asset, and it's just, we like to shine the light of appreciation and understanding on it. And that's what the point of this program was. I think we did it. Thank you, Al. Thank you, everybody, for, I'm looking at the camera. Thanks, everybody, for attending. Al, final words?
I just thank you all for turning out on a late evening on a Wednesday. So I appreciate it.
This has been fun. Take care, everybody. We'll have a recording, or at least a part of a recording. I didn't start it till a little late. Up on the Friends of Blackwater website real soon. Thank you. Bye.